expanded in the United States? Why has the expansion of suffrage been controversial? How have advocates of expanded suffrage used their rights under the First Amendment to achieve their goals? You may begin.
The history of the United States is one of the expansion of rights. New York Times columnist Anna Quindlen stated in a 1993 article, "Look back, to slavery, to suffrage, to integration, and one thing is clear. Fashions and bigotry come and go. The right thing lasts." Initial limitations on suffrage, such as property ownership, were easily abolished. In 1788, the requirements of white voters to have property became popularized. By 1850, nearly all property ownership and tax requirements were eliminated with ease, unlike many other sectors of society, which brought about controversy over the expansion of suffrage.
Though the 14th and 15th Amendments were expected to further suffrage, the Civil War amendments did little to enfranchise minorities. States recoiled to their original dispositions after Reconstruction. Extreme violence broke out against minorities as they attempted to exercise their right to vote. Additionally, local governments implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, all of which were upheld by the Supreme Court of Williamsburg, Mississippi in 1898.
It was not until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s that black suffrage was permanent. Protesters used newspapers like the Birmingham World and protests such as the March on Washington to express their grievances on a national scale. This movement eventually ended racial segregation and voter discrimination through the 24th Amendment and Voting Rights Act of 1965. Congressman Charles B. Regal once expressed, "The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was indeed a vital instrument of democracy, ensuring the integrity and reliability of the democratic process that we as a country hold so dear."
This sentiment held true until the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision declaring Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. It opened the door for states with a history of discrimination to pass voting laws without direct approval from the federal government. As a result, there's been a sharp increase in voter ID laws as well as voter redistricting. These highly controversial laws have decreased voter participation and been compared to a modern poll tax.
The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 was an important step in the emerging effort for women to gain enfranchisement. Suffragettes like Susan B. Anthony advocated for women's suffrage through the late 1800s as they were under the impression that the 14th Amendment would guarantee them suffrage. However, the 1875 Minor v. Haberset decision asserted that citizenship did not guarantee suffrage.
While the 19th Amendment did not overturn the decision, it did assert the government could not discriminate on account of gender. Speaking about the condition of women pre-19th Amendment, novelist and sociologist Charlotte Bronte stated, "Women had no voice in the management of the country, no control over her property, no control of her own children, no control even of her own person. If that is not a condition of slavery, it bears a close resemblance to it."
Men are required to sign up for the selective service within 30 days of turning 18. With the onset of World War II, this became problematic. In 1942, the phrase "old enough to fight, old enough to vote" was coined as 19-year-old men were sent off to war, but were still silenced at the polls. The fight for the lowered voting age continued during the Vietnam conflict, when a substantial number of men were being drafted against their will, deprived of the opportunity to cast a vote for a national leader. Their efforts paid off when the 26th Amendment was ratified.
Suffrage is still being expanded, particularly in respect to felons and resident aliens. While a felon acting in violation of a social contract should not be allowed the right to vote, and is not allowed to in most states, the right should be renewed upon their return to society. Recently, states such as Maryland have expanded this right on the premise that once released from prison, they are active citizens and equally affected by the laws.
Similarly, resident aliens have shown interest in participating in democracy and should have a role in deciding who represents them. Maine and Vermont have both recognized this and expanded suffrage to immigrants. However, most states are hesitant because, like all cases, expanding suffrage means sharing power. Specifically, sharing power with a diversified voter pool, which can lead to losses for certain political groups. Thank you.
You talked in your testimony about barriers to voting. There were several examples of either actual barriers or the attempt to raise barriers in the most recent election. Can you tell me about some of them?
One of the most prominent barriers that we can see is after the Shelby v. Holder decision, the increase of voter ID laws as well as redistricting or gerrymandering. We can see specifically with voter ID laws in the state of Texas, it's estimated that between 600,000 and 800,000 people within that state alone do not have the voter ID necessary to vote, but would have all of the other voter qualifications and in a sense are essentially disenfranchised.
This would cause them to go possibly during a work day where they can't get to the poll center. This would cause them to lose the right to vote and voice in the nation.
However, currently the Supreme Court is hearing a decision on gerrymandering for Corey v. Harris. And this deals with the gerrymandering situation of racial minorities and how they were being restricted on their right to vote based on gerrymandering.
Right to fight, right to vote. Can you make an argument for lowering the voting age?
We can see parallel to the idea of right to fight, right to vote, is that there is a double standard, specifically to look toward the idea that it is possible for a minor to be charged as an adult, and in this sense can be affected by the laws as an adult, but do not in many, but outside of San Francisco, in the most recent election where they were allowed to vote as 16-year-olds, do not have the ability to vote as an adult. And so we can see that just like the double standard with the right to fight, right to vote standard, this is another double standard within our society.
Additionally, expanding suffrage to the younger generation engenders a population which would implement a core standard for education on the government and more courses like We the People in our society today and our education system. So with as America is a laboratory of democracy, by lowering the voting age to 16 in San Francisco for local elections allows for the scientific process and seeing how things will play out with 16-year-olds voting, and if education is more directed towards the government and process and how you should become a citizen and perform your civic duty.
So there's been a lot of people who have worked really hard to expand suffrage and expand people's right to vote, but then people who have the right to vote don't choose to exercise that right. Do you believe that voting should be mandatory? And if so, or if not, what specific constitutional principles would permit or disallow a law requiring mandatory voting?
Yeah, it's a fairly radical jump to go from a right to vote to a requirement to vote. We can see specifically that with the right to vote comes with it the right not to vote if you do not believe in the current political climate or anything of that nature. You do have the right not to vote and the right to exercise that ability, and therefore it is part of your democratic voice to abstain from going to the polls.
However, to increase voter turnout, we can see that in Oregon with absentee ballot voting, they have had voter turnout of over 70%. So if every state essentially has the option to have the absentee ballot, then we can increase voter turnout.
If we were to force people to vote, they might possibly just vote the party line. Just specifically say, I'm just going to go in to vote for a certain party. By forcing them to exercise a right that they have now and forcing them to do so possibly in the future, this will cause the nation to have a multitude of uneducated voters going to the polls and not truly representing the nation.
However, if we decide to have a compulsory voting system, as we see in many other a couple other countries today, then this could provide implications that if there's a no option or a vote none option, then people, like my colleague was saying, would have to vote down the party line or would just become lazy voters if there was not an option for none of the above.
However, if we did have compulsory voting, it would obviously be necessary to have an opt-out option.
Why did women argue that the 14th Amendment gave them the right to vote, and how did the Supreme Court counter their argument?
The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is what the women used to gain or to fight for their enfranchisement.
We also look towards the Privileges and Immunities Clause. However, specifically under the case of minors, however, if we look towards later in the 14th Amendment, specifically in Article 3, they mention how men 21 years and older should have the right to vote, and they use that argument within the Supreme Court to deny women the right to vote within the 14th Amendment.
This upcoming week, the electoral colleges will be going to cast their vote for president. Now, the popular vote, as we know, didn't go the same way as the anticipated vote in the electoral college. Is the electoral college relevant today, and how does that impact suffrage?
The Electoral College is necessary today, and if we look to the case of Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court ultimately decided who the president was, there needs to be the Electoral College to decide in cases where there are discrepancies with voting.
Additionally, as you can see, with Hillary winning only north of 600 counties candidate Miss Secretary Hillary and President-elect Trump winning over 3,000 counties, there's an extreme discrepancy between the metropolitan areas, and with Hillary, Miss Clinton winning over 2 million of the votes, then it is essentially that we keep the Electoral College as it is because it keeps the geographic distributions, so metropolitan areas don't just roll over and people in more rural areas can have a voice as well.
However, we can see that the original purposes of the Electoral College ultimately don't exist anymore. We have the technology that counting an accurate popular vote is fairly easy today, as well as the original purpose of the Electoral College was to ultimately decrease the influence of political parties. However, today, when people cast their vote for their electors, they're essentially electing who the president will be and not necessarily a nonpartisan elector.
Well done. John Douglas.
I liked, especially from this morning, everyone participated in this round. Equally, I don't think any of you dominated. You're still very confident. I like your reasoning. I would have liked to see more tying it back to the Constitution, right? We're in kind of an opinion section, or this question is more opinion-based. And Mr. Cake had this comment for the last group we had. Remember to tie it back to some part of the Constitution. That's why we're here, right? The perfect example is when he asks, should you be forced to vote, right? What's your First Amendment right to vote or not vote, right? You can exercise that right, I guess, as an expression and say, well, I don't want to vote because I think all of the candidates are terrible, right? So keep that in mind.
I thought you guys did a very good job. The reasoning and the support for your arguments is excellent, and that's really what this is all about. Anyone can argue. It's about being able to support your argument and showing why your argument may potentially be more accurate or better than the opposing argument. The next question I was going to ask is, I think it's sometimes a bit inconsistent when you argue against gerrymandering, but yet for the Electoral College, which is essentially constitutional gerrymandering. And so maybe there's different reasons. Maybe gerrymandering is, the way that some of these states are doing it, they're based upon what party you're going to vote for or what race you are, and that's different from the Electoral College, where it's about geographical fairness. So consider that was going to be my next question. So something to think about.
I don't have too much to add. I think you guys did great. Your icon tactics is great. Your presentation is spectacular. You play off of each other, and you don't miss a beat. It's not like you're on the same wavelength all the time. I am very fond of the ability to relate the constitutional concepts back to current events. And I think you guys did a great job about the Bush Gore decision. What was going on in Texas.
And one more. Wow. You guys did an amazing job. Truly. I am very, very impressed here this afternoon. I will tell you, this is the first time in testimony I've heard the discussion of the voters' rights act. I thought I was going to hear that all day long. I heard none of it, except from you guys. It's the first time I've heard a substantive discussion of resident aliens being able to vote and citations to states where this is being considered. The one thing I'd